Thank you all for being here today. It is really nice to see a pleasantly full room tonight, because back when I was studying at RISD, I used to work as the programming liaison for my department. And so I know exactly how much work it is to fill a room at RISD. So thank you all for coming out tonight despite the rain. I want to extend my thanks to the RISD Research Office for supporting this event. This event is supported by the Spur Fund, and this is in fact my last hurrah with the Spur Fund, and I'm really grateful for how it has enabled this book that I will soon be sharing with you. I also want to give a quick shout out to Joe Lamzan and Akela Harper, who are two very talented RISD students who are here to document this event for me tonight, so thank you to you both. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Ruchika Nambiar. I am a book artist, designer, and writer, and I produce experimental, interactive books and stories, though I treat the word book very loosely, as you will soon see. I graduated from RISD in 2023 from the Global Arts and Cultures MA program, which is part of the Liberal Arts division here at RISD. And since then, I've been teaching in the Department of Illustration alongside my independent practice. I have always liked doing many different things, and I never force myself to choose. So over the last decade, I have been building a practice that is specifically designed around never having to choose. And so I do many different things like bookmaking, graphic design, visual art, miniature making, writing, and research. And I keep looking for ways to smush all of those things together into a single object, which you will soon see in some of my projects. I did my undergrad back in India in an art school not unlike RISD, where I majored in graphic design. And there we had a liberal arts program too. And I used to really enjoy taking those classes because I liked reading and writing, and they made me feel a lot smarter than all of the other art students who hated those classes. And that is sometimes the reason we do things. But it made me discover that I had a genuine appetite and a knack for critical thinking and writing. And I had this philosophy professor, and I took every class of his, and he remains one of my mentors to this day. And I remember in my first class with him, he had said to us, "Opinions are worthless," which is very different from what the 21st century had taught me so far, which is that everyone has this amazing, wonderful, precious, sacred thing called an opinion. But he said, everyone has an opinion. They're worth nothing. And it's only when you learn how to turn your opinion into a logical, airtight argument that you lend it any real value. Otherwise, it's no different from any Tom, Dick, and Harry with an opinion. And that was when I understood what it meant to do research and to do critical thinking, to move beyond flimsy, opinionated rants and turn them into persuasive, solid arguments. Because critical thinking is a muscle like anything else, a muscle that you exercise through reading and writing and engaging in rigorous inquiry and expressing it with clarity. And we gravitate towards people who can provide us that clarity, whether it's a philosopher or a writer or a filmmaker or an artist or a poet or even a YouTuber. We gravitate towards people who can untangle our knotted jumble of thoughts and feelings and make sense of the world for us. And it was in his classes that I learned what it really meant to think well, to think with clarity, to identify an inquiry that's deeply important to me and investigate it rigorously, and then untangle and communicate the complexity of my thoughts with clarity. And I learned that there was a craft to critical thinking and writing, just like an artist learns to paint or a woodworker learns to build a chair. And this space for unencumbered critical thinking is what drew me to academia in the first place. Because whereas in a creative practice, one must find ways to cleverly package complexity or to whittle things down to like a catchy headline or to entertain, to engage, to immerse. In academia, I was not expected to simplify complexity. I could unapologetically present an argument in all its fullness, and I didn't have to worry about being particularly interesting or engaging or about whittling it down to a catchy headline or an entertaining anecdote. Because, I mean, I am that person who writes excruciatingly long, philosophically dense emails to my friends, and for the first time I realized there was an actual audience who had the stomach to digest something like that. And it was like magical to me that there existed an audience for this type of content and that kind of reading. But even so, I have this push-pull relationship with academia. precisely because of its opaque inaccessibility to non-academic audiences. I mean, I didn't like the idea of writing something that my own mother would fall asleep reading. And that really frustrated me because academics are continuously theorizing these incredible new insights about our everyday realities, and they have the power to resolve deep frustrations and anxieties that we carry with us about several features of our lives and the world around us. They see more than most. They're trained to notice patterns and structures, detect anomalies and absurdities in our social, political, and cultural landscapes. And they literally hold the power to change the way that we imagine the world. And they have such a small audience for it, limited to their disciplines or their institutions or their conferences and their symposiums. And it's too dense and heavy for most people to consume. It's like really nutritious food, but that's so bland that nobody other than the crazy health freaks want to eat it. And so my training as a designer and a visual artist really resisted this style of dissemination. Because best case scenario, a researcher might be a fantastic writer who knows how to keep you hooked with really compelling prose. But that's usually as far as their creative arm can stretch. But being an interdisciplinary practitioner, I know that there are creative strategies beyond just text that could let you take all of that high-resolution, dense, critical thought and couch it within actual, everyday, relatable experience. So in my mind, that isn't a content problem. It's a communication problem. I look at all of it and say there are literally 100 different ways to cook and plate that dish better. Because as far as I see it, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. We're all trying to think through our experience and say something about the world that we live in. And we just have different tools to express it. So if you're an academic, you may say it through your research and writing. And if you're an artist, you may say it through your paintings or films or poetry or comics. And if you're an accountant, maybe you don't have any readily accessible tools to say it, and it'll instead come out in the midst of a heated argument that you're having with yourself in the shower. But it all just comes down to what communicative tools you have at your disposal. And with this talk, I'm hoping that you leave here today with a few more tools than you came in with. Before I do that, though, I want to talk about this harsh binary that gets created between the artist and the academic and how to go about dissolving it. I have now been part of 2 creative institutions that talk constantly about bringing artists and researchers together. And they have this wonderful fantasy of creating the perfect symbiotic environment in which artists and academics work together to solve all the world's problems. But despite that, these 2 domains continue to remain not only very insulated, but also somewhat contemptuous of each other. I mean, literally talk to anybody in the liberal arts department and they'll tell you how they feel like the ignored stepchild of the institution. But creative students are often begrudgingly tolerating all the reading and writing that they have to endure in their compulsory liberal arts classes, while traditional academics often look upon creatives with contempt because of their frivolous or flippant approach to research, seemingly. Because creatives who do research are often just seen to be sprinkling it on as garnish rather than really appreciating the rigorous labor and craftsmanship that goes into the practice of critical thinking. This gap is largely due to a fundamental difference in their calling, their agenda, and you can see this breakdown take place when you put them in the same room together to work on something, because the creative practitioner cannot help but do something to broadcast, fix, alleviate the problem at hand, or heal the problem at hand. And the academic cannot help but think about every facet, every contradiction, every anomaly, every complication, every caveat that in all likelihood makes said problem virtually unsolvable. And it's not like the other is not doing, it's not like the academic is not necessarily doing the doing or the creative is not necessarily doing the thinking, but rather this where their priority lies kind of separates them and pulls them apart in terms of actually taking action towards something. So it's like the brain versus the hand. The hand is constantly itching to act. The brain is constantly coming up with reasons why action must be put off until further consideration. And so practically the way we see this play out is that the creative may roll their eyes at the over-analytical paralysis of the academic, and the academic will grind their teeth over the brash impulsiveness of the creative. And they're both somewhat right about each other, but only because they're operating on fundamentally different agendas and priorities. And no matter how many conversations we encourage between them, this divide doesn't dissolve itself until we bridge those conflicting agendas. They can't productively work together until they see how one may further the agenda of the other instead of setting it back. Instead, they're far too frustrated with what the other cannot do rather than what they can. Because creative practitioners are often armed with tools to observe and study patterns of human behavior, experience, consumption, cultural diversity, with a great degree of sensitivity and emotional intelligence. But they sometimes lack the theoretical grounding to process their discoveries in robust and nuanced ways or to historically contextualize them. On the other hand, academics are armed with extremely sophisticated tools for sense-making, and yet they're rarely trained in the art of making their products digestible to a wider audience. And the first step to bridging that gap is to understand that academics or researchers are in fact creative by nature. Research at its very essence is a creative practice, with namely the ability to create. So what defines the researcher is their ability to produce original insight, to carve out a space, no matter how small, that did not exist so far in the world's intellectual landscape. And it demands an active exercise of one's imaginative faculties to envision a perspective that doesn't yet exist and then call it into being. And that's no small creative feat. And so thinking of research as a creative activity has the potential to resolve a lot of the illusory conflicts that exist between researchers and creative practitioners who are, at their very core, actually pursuing the same type of work. And where previously they may have squabbled over their conflicting methodologies, this framework may help them realign and instead bond over the similarities in their intentions, while newly appreciating the advantages of their methodological differences. And this lets us then position them, both the traditional researcher and the creative practitioner, on the same spectrum of practice. They're just on different ends of it. Both are trying to communicate a perspective that is presumably specific and original. But there are two key differences that push them to opposite ends of the spectrum. Because the creative practitioner, the artist or the designer, the novelist, the filmmaker, is typically more successful at disseminating their perspective, whereas the researcher is more concerned in the production and validation of that perspective itself. And what separates these two practitioners is their lack of any particular obligation to the other end of the spectrum. The creative practitioner does not have to vet their perspective. They can get away just fine with making bold, sweeping claims that don't hold up in court, because who's trying them after all, when everything can simply be explained away by the subjectivity of opinion and art. And the researcher does not have to be engaging or interesting in their forms of dissemination so long as their theory is well developed and airtight. And like I was saying, they fail to really see what value can be had from trying to reach out and grasp the other end of the spectrum, trying to do both, trying to really bring both of those two skills together. And so for me, the first step is always to dissolve the disciplinary lens and strip down to what someone is trying to do at their very core. I don't think of myself through a disciplinary lens, and so I don't like to apply it to anyone else either. I don't care if I'm speaking to an artist or an academic or someone else. I try to address them first and foremost as people at the very fundamental level of shared human experience. I'm more concerned with whether you laugh at my joke than whether you will understand some esoteric reference to Aristotle. So I like to think about what really grinds someone's gears, what worries them, what frustrates them, what excites them, what soothes them. Did they secretly want to be a famous singer and they never took the leap of faith and they've been secretly frustrated all their lives? So I like to find that level of shared human experience and try to speak to people on that level as much as I can manage it. And when you start thinking past their disciplines, it automatically forces you to take a communication-first approach. What is the best way to get through to someone? That's not a disciplinary question necessarily. I was originally trained as a graphic designer, and so that makes me a communicator above all else. That's what's on my mind at all times. That is my craft. So no matter what form my work takes, that's the question that I'm always wrestling with and trying to answer better and better each time. And it's not just about communicating the content of your thoughts, but also the shape and structure of your thoughts, because that's what makes it make sense in your head, and you need to transfer that shape and structure to someone else in order for it to make sense to them too. So this semester, for example, I happen to be teaching the MFA thesis writing course for the illustration graduate students, and they're writing their thesis books in my class. And I remember one of them asked me, it was more of a technical question. They asked me, should I include the names of my classmates in my acknowledgements? I kind of want to, but it doesn't quite fit in with the list of other professors and advisors that I'm thanking, but I don't want to exclude them either. And there's so many times, not just with this question, but with others that come up in this class and other classes as well, there's so many times where I find myself saying to them, That's not a content problem, that's a design problem. Because why do you feel like you need to choose one or the other? The right design strategy can let you do both. I mean, you can put their names in parentheses, you can put an asterisk and footnote their names, you can draw an arrow and handwrite their names. Whatever weight or significance they carry in your head, design can help you visualize that on the page. And that's why I say that everyone, no matter what their job, should have some basic skills in graphic and communication design. And it doesn't matter if you're an accountant or a doctor or an academic or an artist, because this may communicate the content of my thoughts, but that communicates the structure of them. And just the ability to work competently with text and image can completely transform the way in which you show up in the world. And that, again, is not a disciplinary thing. It has nothing to do with what discipline you're in. You could literally benefit from this no matter what your job, no matter what your discipline. Because I actually don't see graphic design as a thing that some people do and other people don't. I see it as a language that some people happen to speak better than others. And so learning how to speak it better can make you better at communicating yourself, and can literally transform the way that you show up in your lives, in your careers. And I don't believe that effective communication is possible by appealing to our cognitive faculties alone, because it's not about whether something is cognitively accessible, but rather whether it is experientially absorbable. Does an idea click into place? Does it sit right? It's not about whether something is technically comprehensible to people, but rather whether they're able to assimilate and integrate it into their practical experience of the world around them. So I don't care if it's a nail-biting thriller or a dry and technical essay in a journal. Does it stick with you? And to make it stick, it's important to engage people's imaginative faculties, not just their intellectual ones, to enable visualization or immersion, not just into the content of your thoughts, but into the shape and structure of them. And so I'm going to take you through some of the formal tools and strategies that I use in my own work to do this. Narrative is obviously storytelling is a big one, and that's because it is so effective in facilitating immersion into the ebb and flow of your thoughts. Because rather than just stating a particular concept, it allows you to journey towards it, possibly from a place of incomprehension to a place of greater comprehension. I think of narrative as this subtle, unobtrusive tool for persuasion, because it takes you on a journey from point A to point B, and hopefully transforms you in that process, and it can empathize you towards points of view that were previously alien or unfamiliar, and it helps you get on the same page. And it does this by inserting information within the framework of experience. So, for example, no one ever says, "I find this joke funny." That's just conveying information. Instead, you say something like, "Ha ha," because that's when you allow the other person to experience how funny you found the joke. And that's how I think of narrative in its most granular sense. It can be something as minor as a shift in your literary tactics. Alison Bechdel's graphic memoirs, for example, are a great example of how really dense theoretical material like literature or psychology is interwoven intricately into the fabric of her personal narrative. Another technique I like to use quite often in my projects, and specifically in my writing projects, is what I like to call anecdotal sandwiching. So whenever I'm writing a more academic piece of text, I find it really vital to ease my reader into a set of ideas through the lens of my personal experience. And so I use several anecdotes as a point of entry when I start a chapter, when I start a section, because I want and I need my reader to start from the point of experience, not the point of insight. I want them to first match my experience first and then journey with me towards the theoretical insight. So I get to the theory in all of its academic glory eventually, but I always ease them in with an anecdote first. And these anecdotes can take several forms in my work, at least. Sometimes I start with a WhatsApp conversation with my friend, or a story from my childhood, or an email to my therapist. And this is because I want my reader in the thick of the experience with me. I want them to feel like they're arriving at the insight through their own experience. Rather than me telling them what to think, I want them to experience the arc of the epiphany with me. Another thing that is a useful thing to keep in mind is self-awareness and using it kind of like a tool. Because obviously one particular challenge that crops up is the inherent subjectivity of narrative representation and the problems that could potentially cause in a more formal academic context. But I believe one way to successfully integrate narrative into more formal and serious types of expression is if you're able to show full awareness of your own biases, because you cannot hope to credibly communicate something through the lens of personal experience without utter self-awareness. And so self-awareness helps neutralize a lot more of those subjective elements that sometimes don't fit into a more academic project. This was The Breadcrumb, which was a graphic memoir that I wrote actually at the very end of my undergraduate education, but it was essentially like a stream of consciousness narrative that was investigating themes around individualism and sort of this very sort of navel-gazing project, but kind of turned in on itself and had multiple different characters and voices that were layered on top of one another. The other thing that I also like to do, and this comes from being a sort of interdisciplinary practitioner who works across different mediums, is I like finding ways to blend multiple registers of writing and thinking. And so that also helps with being able to express those moments of self-awareness. This is a tactic that can help do that because it allows you to include self-aware commentary, introduce moments of doubt or confusion or contradiction or hypocrisy. So this, for example, is a graphic essay that I had created 2 years ago where I was writing in a very academic style, but I was also layering it over with self-aware meta-commentary on my own process of writing this essay. So I was inserting things like text messages or conversations with myself or handwritten annotations in the margins that were allowing me to basically add a new layer of contemplation on top of my theoretical writing. And that can help represent your actual convoluted thinking patterns with greater nuance and integrity. So if something is speculation, you get to call it out. If you feel conflicted about a claim you're making, you get to call it out. And design choices, various design and formal strategies can help you represent these different voices and registers of writing. Another thing that I like to use very much is humor as a tool. And because it can instantly snap your audience onto the same page as you. Laughter is a really intense manifestation of resonance. And if you can make someone laugh, it means that you've got them on the same frequency, even if just for a moment. And the best part is, even if you don't write funny, you can lean on someone else's jokes to make your point. And so you should loosen up to more creative styles of writing where you can feel comfortable drawing in more informal sources because it can help, again, create this moment of experiential resonance within which you will be you'll find it much easier to deliver your denser, theoretical, abstracted insights when you can get people on the same experiential page as you. And humor can be really powerful in doing that. Which brings me to my next tool, which is interweaving pop culture. And I see a lot of people approach the idea of citation, like academic citation, in this very restricted, begrudging manner, like it's a chore for them to tick off. And I say, no, cite something that actually resonates with you. Cite someone because they took the words right out of your mouth, because they said something better than you ever could. And very often for me, I encounter those examples in my everyday life and not necessarily in academic journals and textbooks. And so I often use comics and scenes from movies and TV shows or song lyrics, social media posts, and even memes as an establishing shot so that my reader knows where I'm at, mentally speaking. And because I want my reader to feel the instant sense of relatability or humor when looking at a meme, or I want them to feel empathy or irritation or frustration towards a movie character. I want them to smirk or click their tongue or roll their eyes at something, and then use that as an entry point to introduce a more complex, dense idea about whatever phenomenon I'm trying to observe and comment on. So for example, I may open with an SNL skit, which is something you'll see when I demo that book for you. I may open with an SNL skit to make them feel irritation towards millennials before I embark on my theories about what causes millennial entitlement. So if you can achieve a moment of resonance with your audience, whether through laughter or grief or anger or frustration, they will become that much more absorbent to your theories. Another thing that I like to use is also this idea of metaphoric transposition. And I find metaphors really unique in their ability to bypass every cognitive framework and instantly insert someone right in the center of a really complex web of experience. And it does this through transposition. So for example, you may not know what it feels like to be on the first day of a new job, and it makes you nervous and you don't quite know what to do with that experience. And you may want to quit instantly. But you may very well know what it feels like to jump into a cold pool of water. You know what that feels like because at some point you've probably encountered that kind of experience in your life. And so if I were to equate those two experiences through a metaphor, you can instantly insert yourself right in the center of that experience and all of its implications. And that gives us clues as to how that experience needs to be navigated. So if you're lost at a new job and you don't have your bearings and you just want to quit, if you can identify the perfect metaphor to capture your experience, you'll have new clues as to what to do next. Because anybody who jumps into a cold pool of water will tell you all you need to do is just wait a short while. It's getting better with every moment, and your body will soon adjust to the temperature. And suddenly, you have a new kind of resilience to wait it out. Because in a sense, through the metaphor, you've already endured the entire life cycle of that experience, and you already know and can sense how it plays out. And that gives you a way to cope with the experience at hand more effectively. So instead of cognitively thinking about how to last and survive a new job, you think of it experientially through a metaphor of a completely different scenario that is cognitively different but experientially similar. And so this can prove really useful to communicate an idea to someone that may not have had the same experiences as you. Because metaphors are powerful literary tools to help instantly insert you into the structure of an experience completely freed from all the cognitive fuss. For example, this website sadly doesn't exist anymore, and I don't know why they stopped it, but there is this website called the Sideways Dictionary, which was basically taking these, complex digital concepts like encryption or blockchain, things that are, sort of very complex concepts that we may or may not fully understand the implications of. And it was basically crowdsourcing metaphoric explanations and definitions for all of these concepts and all of these terms, and you could upvote the definitions that you liked best, so that they would show up even higher in the hierarchy of the website. And so that was actually a really useful website. And again, I don't know why it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know why they took it down. Another example is Dilip Dakuna, who is an architect, and his book, The Invention of Rivers, again starts helping us sort of visualize our relationship with water and water bodies, and how he talks about how our entire relationship with rivers and with water changed the minute we started drawing rivers as lines on a map, and how that completely changed our imagination around water, and then subsequently the ways in which we engage with different water bodies, the ways in which we build dams and canals and all of these different structures. Another thing, and it's quite an obvious one again, is I am a very visual person. I think in terms of detailed three-dimensional structures, and so a large part of my exposition involves diagrams and structural visualizations to make structures and frameworks, relationships, and processes visible to people. I find that there's something very non-negotiable about the clarity of a diagram. And we get a much greater sense of which elements are movable or which ones are not. We see what's fluid versus what's solid or static. We understand what lies in a spectrum versus what constitutes a binary. And it can bring an almost physical sense of tangible clarity to concepts that are otherwise really nebulous and hard to grasp. Another example is this artist, Chris Jordan, who basically creates these ginormous photo collage data visualizations, and essentially he prints them as these ginormous collages. And so his ability to kind of represent or capture the shock that comes with certain environmental statistics, for example, without flattening or compressing them down into sort of inert numerical figures the way that an infographic does. He's able to represent those numbers in all of their uncompressed, shocking glory, unlike a lot of other forms of data visualization that look to compress, that look to flatten into very specific numbers that don't necessarily carry the same impact or shock value. And another technique that I always find myself drawn to is this interplay between fact and fiction, and specifically using things like speculative fiction that can exaggerate or extrapolate from reality in order to produce new insights that are otherwise hard to access. When I was in undergrad, I developed this hypothetical museum proposal called the Living Library of Dystopia, which was modeled kind of like a natural history museum. And so it recreates scenes from dystopian novels in the form of life-size dioramas, and then juxtaposes them against real historical artifacts from the time and context of the novel. So, for example, a scene from Animal Farm juxtaposed with Stalin's doctored photographs, or propaganda posters from Soviet Russia. And the idea was to encourage this notion of learning history through fiction, because a fiction, while exaggerated and not accurate, may be better equipped to capture the more intangible and experiential qualities of a historical moment, far more than a textbook can manage. Similarly, this was a dystopian narrative diorama that I had created, which wove a dystopian future inspired by the surrounding neighborhood. It was a public art project. This was installed in a metro station back in India. And it was basically illuminating the inherent alienness of concepts around progress and urban development. And so dystopian stories can take our current reality and then illuminate aspects of it that are otherwise invisible to us, that we don't quite want to confront or look at, because it's delivered in the guise of entertainment. And so your guard is automatically lowered and you are far better primed to embrace ideas that you might have otherwise resisted. And so you don't want to think about fact versus fiction. You want to think about fact and fiction, and how can they play off of each other to produce a fuller picture that honors the tangible and intangible qualities of what you're trying to say. And so all of these techniques expand your idea of what counts as evidence for your research. And as you can see, not all of them necessarily mean that you have to create artwork to accompany your research, but rather that you employ the sensibilities that allow you to blend together a top-down, abstracted, theory-driven approach and a bottom-up, experientially resonant approach. Because artists are great at immersing you in experience, and researchers are great at theorizing complex, abstract ideas that help make sense in a larger scale. But the real magic happens in the middle if you can bring those two things together. And I believe that the best approach to that is a form-fluid one, where you don't limit yourself by the discipline that you belong to, whether that means picking up a new skill yourself or collaborating with someone who works in a different medium. I've found that my form-fluid practice allows me to create objects that can speak to audiences far beyond just academia. As I said before, I'm a communicator above all else. And I travel across disciplinary boundaries, borrowing strategies from all of them to make complex ideas more digestible. And my work plays with the relationship between content and form and interaction, finding new ways to combine writing and image making, object making, to produce an immersive reading experience that engages my audience far more deeply than traditional academia can manage. This, for example, was an interactive essay that I wrote 2 years ago. And so that's what I like to do with my work. I like to find ways in which I'm not necessarily limited by a particular medium or a particular form, but rather, really just kind of listen to what the content is and what it's demanding from me as a creator. And so to me, composing a multimedia book is much the same as writing a piece of text, or maybe perhaps composing music, though I don't do that, so I don't know what that's like. But deciding how it opens, or where to introduce pauses, how it segues from one sentence or chapter to the next, introducing moments of surprise or impact or levity, controlling the pace and rhythm. And the only difference is that my building blocks are not just limited to words and text. Because ultimately, I don't really care what form my work takes. I think about what I want to say, and then I allow the content to whisper in my ear and tell me how to best express itself. And then I bring together whatever skills I need to make it happen. And so with this talk, I'm not necessarily suggesting that academics have to do more creative projects or vice versa. Rather, I'm trying to construct some more accessible, functional bridges between academic research and creative practice with the hope that it serves as a thoroughfare, allowing practitioners like you and me to more easily dialogue back and forth between the two domains. You'll also find that I am soon going to give you one of these little creative research cheat sheets that not only has a little guide listing out all of the best practices and strategies I shared with you here, along with some of the, a lot more of the examples and things like that that I've shared for each of those techniques, but it also has 2 short essays that I had written on why and how to bridge these gaps between the arts and research. So before we move on to our other exciting activities for the evening, I'm going to close out the talk portion of this evening by sharing my recent project, Memes for the Soul, which was my thesis at RISD that I wrote and produced as an interactive artist book. And it really acts as a live case study for pretty much every strategy that I've shared with you today. It was something that I was testing out in this book and trying out every one of those things in different ways. This film was created for me by Juhi Nagpal, who is an FAV senior. She's about to graduate now. So for your enjoyment, Memes for the Soul.